Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into an interesting player in India's power sector, Jaiprakash Power Ventures Limited, or JPVL.
That's right.
If you've ever wondered how a company juggles, thermal power, hydro plants, their own coal mines, even cement grinding,
Hmm.
all while dealing with India's changing energy landscape, well, this is for you.
Exactly. We've been digging into their annual report for 2023-24. And this isn't just numbers and tables. It really gives you a look under the hood.
Right.
From who's making decisions in the boardroom down to the nitty-gritty of, say, their environmental efforts or how efficiently they're using energy. So our aim today is to pull out those key insights. What do you really need to know about their operations, their governance, their financial health?
Okay, let's unpack this then. The report itself, you can find it on their website. It mentions some shareholder stuff too, like book closure dates in late August, early September.
Yeah, practical details.
But for this deep dive, we're focused more on the bigger picture. We're talking about that balancing act, keeping the power flowing, meeting environmental duties, and, staying financially sound.
Absolutely. And this report gives a really detailed view on that balance. The sheer amount of information is quite something. It goes from a high-level board strategy right down to the specifics of running a power plant.
Okay.
So where should we start? Maybe with the leadership, the board of directors, and how the company's governed.
Sounds good. Let's start there. So as of the end of March 2024, the board had 11 members.
Mm-hmm.
You've got a non-executive chairman, a vice chairman, the MD and CEO, a whole-time director,
Right.
and then 6 independent directors, and 2 of those were women.
Yeah, that mix of executive, non-executive, and independent directors is pretty standard, but the specifics are always interesting. 6 out of 11 independent, that's a majority.
It is. And what about the people themselves? Any standouts in terms of experience?
Well, yeah. You look at Sunil Kumar Sharma, the vice chairman. He's got something like 4 decades, over 40 years, in infrastructure projects.
Wow, okay. That's vital experience.
Definitely. And then there's Suren Jain, the managing director and CEO. He's been with the JP Group for a while across different parts of the business. Now he's specifically running the thermal and hydro plants plus the coal mines. So you've got deep, relevant experience right at the top.
And it's not just who they are, but how involved they seem to be. The report mentions attendance records.
It does. It shows who attended which board meetings and the AGM. For instance, Manoj Gower, the chairman, he made all 4 board meetings that year. Suren Jain, too. Perfect attendance.
That suggests they're pretty hands-on, doesn't it?
It certainly points towards an engaged leadership team. Yeah.
Okay. And beyond the main board, there are committees doing specific jobs.
Right. Very important. They've got an audit committee, and significantly, it's made up entirely of independent directors.
Ah, that's generally seen as good practice for objective oversight.
It is. Then there's a nomination and remuneration committee that's for board appointments and pay, which had some changes during the year, and a corporate social responsibility, or CSR, committee.
Guiding their social initiatives.
Exactly.
You mentioned the independent directors making up the audit committee. Did they have other specific roles or meetings?
Yes. They actually held their own separate meeting. It was on March 16th, 2024.
What was the purpose of that?
Well, according to the report, it was to review the performance of the non-independent directors, the board as a whole, and the chairman. They even looked at feedback from other directors.
So a kind of internal check and balance.
Seems like it a pretty robust way to handle internal evaluation, you could say.
And this all ties into their overall approach to corporate governance.
It does. They state their goal is long-term value creation, but they link that directly to things like integrity, societal obligations, environmental responsibility, and following the rules. They specifically mention complying with the Companies Act 2013 and the SEBI regulations. Those are the main legal frameworks in India.
And how do they make sure these independent directors can actually, do their job effectively, especially in a complex industry like power?
Good question. The report mentions a familiarization program to bring them up to speed.
Okay.
And it also states they have access to the company information they need, which sounds basic, but it's crucial for proper oversight.
Absolutely. You can't oversee what you don't understand or can't access.
Precisely. Transparency is key. They also talk about having a clear policy on related party transactions.
Ah, yes. Deals with connected entities.
Right. Making sure those are fair and transparent, avoiding conflicts of interest.
Very important.
And for internal issues, there's a vigil mechanism, essentially a whistleblower policy. It's available on their website, apparently, so people can report concerns confidentially.
Okay. So governance structures seem quite detailed, but Wasn't there a recent issue with SEBI?
Ah, yes. That's important to mention. The report does disclose that in April 2024, JPVL and 4 directors received a show cause notice from SEBI.
Okay, what's that about?
It alleges non-compliance with certain accounting standards, specifically IND AS, for a period stretching back quite a way, from 2012-13 up to 2021-22.
That's a long time frame.
It is. The company says it has submitted its reply, but the matter is still pending.
So something to keep an eye on. It shows that regulatory scrutiny is always there.
Absolutely. Compliance is never static. Okay, shall we move on to the financials, see how the numbers stack up?
Yes, let's dive into the financial performance. What did the auditor's report highlight?
Well, one major point the auditors emphasized was about a subsidiary, JP Arunachal Power Limited, or JAPL. They raised a going concern uncertainty.
Going concern, that sounds serious. What's the issue there?
It seems public sector units have been reluctant to engage with JPL's projects, which basically diminishes the chances of those power projects actually happening. So the auditors are flagging doubt about JPL's ability to continue as a viable business.
And that has financial implications.
Yes, definitely. JPVL has had to make a provision, basically set aside money against the investment, the capital work in progress, and advances related to JPL.
Okay, so that's a specific risk area they're dealing with. What about the overall financial ratios for JPVL itself? How did they look for 23-24 compared to the year before?
There were some interesting movements. The current ratio improved.
Which means better short-term liquidity.
Generally, yes. They attribute it to an adjustment related to customer advances, which lowered their current liabilities.
Oh, okay.
The debt-to-equity ratio saw a slight decrease.
Less reliance on debt, which is usually seen as positive.
Right. And perhaps the most notable improvements were in the debt service coverage ratio and the return on equity. Both went up significantly.
So better ability to cover their debt payments.
Exactly.
Much better.
And generating more profit relative to shareholder investment.
Yes. The report links both improvements directly to increased earnings after tax. So profitability seems to have strengthened quite a bit in the year. That sounds positive, especially given the JPL issue and any ongoing debt management.
It does suggest better operational profitability is helping them manage those challenges.
The report also talks about preference shares issued to lenders as part of a debt resolution plan.
Yes, it details that. There are cumulative compulsory convertible preference shares, so those will eventually become equity.
Diluting existing shareholders, potentially.
Potentially, yes.
Yeah.
And also cumulative redeemable preference shares, which are meant to be paid back over time. Interestingly, the redemption for some of those is linked to the potential sale of their Nigris cement grinding unit.
Ah, so linking debt repayment to asset sales. It shows how complex these restructuring plans can be.
Very complex. It's using different financial tools to manage their debt load.
Are there other financial pressures mentioned, like legal or regulatory issues?
Well, they mention they're actively appealing certain regulatory orders. For example, there's an appeal filed with the Appellate Tribunal for Electricity, APTEL, against an order from the Uttar Pradesh regulator, UPRC.
Okay, so ongoing disputes that could have financial consequences down the line.
Exactly. These things can take time to resolve, and the outcomes aren't always certain.
Let's talk about where their revenue actually comes from. What are the main sources?
It's quite clear from the report, thermal power generation is by far the biggest chunk.
Right.
Then you have income from sand mining, then their captive coal mining operations, which primarily feed one of their thermal plants, and then hydropower.
So despite having hydro assets, coal-fired thermal power is still the dominant part of their business model.
Very much so, based on these figures.
And how do they sell this power? Through long-term agreements.
Mostly, yes. The report details their power purchase agreements, or PPAs. These are crucial for predictable revenue. Their main thermal plants, JBTPP and JNSTPP, have long-term PPAs with Madhya Pradesh Power Management Company and the state government, some running for decades.
Providing stability.
Exactly. And their Vishnuprayag hydro plant has agreements with Uttar Pradesh and also supplies power to Uttarakhand.
Okay. And what about their responsibilities towards smaller suppliers, like MSMEs?
The report addresses that. It includes details on any outstanding payments to micro, small, and medium enterprises, and any interest paid on delays. That transparency is important.
Yeah, fair treatment of the supply chain.
And they also disclose loans, investments, guarantees they've made, as required by law. Give stakeholders a fuller picture of their financial entanglements.
Any mention of internal improvements impacting financials?
Yes, they talk about strengthening internal controls by automating processes, specifically fuel procurement and consumption tracking.
Makes sense. More efficiency, fewer errors, potentially saving money.
Right. And another interesting point, management believes the fair market value of their power plants is actually higher than the value carried on their books.
Meaning they don't expect to write down the value of those big assets anytime soon.
That's the implication, yes. A sign of confidence in the asset's health.
Okay. And finally, on the financial side, they mention sometimes having to sell power on the exchanges.
Yeah, if the state load dispatch center doesn't require all the power they can generate, maybe demand is lower than forecast. They sell the surplus on the open market, the power exchanges.
So, dealing with the fluctuations of grid demand.
Exactly. It's part of the reality of power generation. Okay, shall we switch gears now and look at the operational side? Technology efficiency.
Yes, let's get into the operational aspects. How are they running these plants day to day?
Well, one focus seems to be on efficiency. At their JB Bina Thermal Power Plant, JBTPP, they highlight efforts to reduce auxiliary power consumption.
That's the power the plant uses itself, right? Not what it sells.
Exactly. Power for pumps, lights, controls, all the internal stuff. If you reduce that, more power goes to the grid, which means better overall efficiency.
Makes sense. How do they do it?
The report mentions optimizing operations and even running with fewer cooling water pumps for a long period because the weather was favorable. Little tweaks can add up.
Smart. And what about environmental tech at the plants?
A big one is the installation of a wet line flue gas desulfurization plant, WLFGD, also at JBTPP.
That's for removing sulfur dioxide.
Yes, a major pollutant from burning coal. They're aiming to get this operational by the end of 2026. It's a significant investment to meet stricter environmental norms.
Okay, so addressing emissions from the thermal side, what about upgrades at the hydro plant, Vishnuprayag?
Yeah, some interesting tech upgrades there, mainly focused on safety and data. They've put in an automatic water level recorder and a velocity sensor upstream.
For real-time water flow data.
Exactly. Helps manage water better for generation and safety.
And speaking of safety, they mention improving flood warning.
They do. They've installed automated sirens and PA systems downstream from the dam.
To warn communities.
Yes. And crucially, these systems have solar power and battery backup, so they should work even if the main power goes out during, say, heavy rains.
That's really important in those areas, reliable warning systems.
Definitely. And they've built in redundancy with dual SIMs, options for satellite or fiber optic connection. And they're sharing the data directly with the State Disaster Management Authority. Good coordination.
What else at the hydro plant?
They upgraded the 11 kV distribution system and, importantly, the protection system, basically replacing old electrical relays with newer, more advanced numerical ones. The old system dated back to 2006 when the plant was commissioned.
So improving reliability and safety of the electrical gear.
Correct. And they mentioned similar relay upgrades at the Bina thermal plant, too, to prevent accidental shutdowns.
So it seems like a consistent effort across both thermal and hydro to use technology for better safety, reliability, and data.
That's a picture it paints, yes.
Yeah.
Proactive maintenance and modernization.
Okay, that covers operations and tech. Let's move to the broader ESG picture, environment, social, and governance.
Right. ESG is a huge focus area now. JPVL details their efforts here. Their CSR, corporate social responsibility activities, are often channeled through Jaiprakash, which is their social wing. The annual report has a whole annexure dedicated to CSR. Although, it's worth noting, the report does mention they didn't meet the required CSR spending threshold for the year based on their profits.
Ah, okay. So they have the structure, but maybe didn't hit the spending target that year.
Seems so. But they still list ongoing projects in areas like education and health.
And the report includes other specific sections on things like energy conservation and technology absorption.
Yes, Annexure E covers those, plus foreign exchange details. It provides more granularity on those aspects.
What about environmental risk management specifically? Waste resources.
They talk about waste management, especially ash from the thermal plants. They mention ongoing research into ash utilization, finding ways to use it productively.
Which is a big issue for coal power.
Huge. They also highlight the hydro plant's contribution to renewable energy and the captive coal mines securing fuel for their Nigri plant. And of course, compliance with environmental laws.
How do they manage waste streams at the plants?
For the thermal plants, they describe procedures for storing and handling hazardous waste according to rules, using authorized recyclers for disposal. They report being compliant with the State Pollution Control Board standards.
Okay. And the S in ESG, the social side, health, safety, employees.
Big focus there, too. They state a commitment to occupational health and safety, mentioning ESG risk frameworks and regular assessments.
And employee well-being.
They provide details on health insurance coverage for both permanent staff and other workers, though the coverage levels might differ. The report also shows turnover rates for employees and workers, which can sometimes indicate workforce stability or issues.
Do they have formal safety systems?
Yes, they mentioned their health and safety management system is certified to ISO 45001, which is a global standard.
Go.
They also detail specific safety measures, especially during plant shutdowns like safety training. And they confirm life insurance or compensation is provided in case of accidental death for employees and workers.
What about their wider impact, like on their suppliers?
They mention efforts to ensure their value chain partners, like suppliers, comply with rules on paying statutory dues like taxes and employee benefits. So trying to expand responsibility outwards.
And investing in their own workforce, training.
The report gives percentages of employees permanent and other covered by training programs. Shows investment in skills.
How do they engage with different groups, investors, communities?
They outline mechanisms for stakeholder engagement with investors, civil society, suppliers, etc.
Any issues reported, like complaints?
Encouragingly, they report 0 complaints received from employees or workers regarding things like sexual harassment, discrimination, or child labor for the last 2 fiscal years.
That's a positive sign for the workplace environment.
It is.
Okay, back to the E environment. What about specific metrics? Energy, water use.
They provide figures for energy intensity and water intensity, and they highlight implementing 0 liquid discharge systems at both the Bina and Nigri thermal plants.
What does that mean exactly?
It means they treat and reuse wastewater within the plant, like water used for handling ash or sewage. It drastically reduces the need to draw fresh water.
So, significant water conservation efforts.
Seems so. They also list the types and amounts of waste-generated plastic, e-waste, hazardous, non-hazardous, and state. They manage it according to regulations. One slightly odd point is they report NIL water withdrawal and consumption for both the last 2 fiscal years.
Nil. For power plants, that seems unlikely.
It does seem unusual. It might be a reporting convention or something that needs clarification. Perhaps it refers only to certain types of withdrawal.
What about emissions?
They report Scope 1 and Scope 2 greenhouse gas emission intensity as 0.
0. For thermal plants.
Again, it seems unusual. They do state they don't have a monitoring system for Scope 2 emissions, which are indirect emissions from purchased electricity, but 0 for Scope 1, direct emissions, from thermal plants would need more explanation.
Okay, so some environmental metrics might need a closer look or clarification in future reports.
Potentially. They do confirm having a cybersecurity policy, providing a link, which is increasingly vital.
And no major product recalls or consumer complaints reported.
Correct.
All right. So, wrapping this up, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive into GPVL's report?
Well, you definitely see a company with diverse operations, thermal, hydro, coal, cement grinding. It's complex. There's a clear structure for corporate governance, aligned with regulations, and an increasing focus on ESG reporting, even if some metrics raise questions.
And financially, it's a bit of a mixed picture.
Yeah. You've got positive signs like improved profitability ratios and debt reduction efforts, but also significant challenges like the going concern issue with the Arunachal subsidiary and the pending SEBI notice.
And operationally, there's this effort to balance efficiency, like reducing auxiliary power with environmental upgrades like the SO2 scrubbers and technology adoption for safety and reliability.
Exactly. It's that constant balancing act. Managing existing assets, meeting regulations, addressing financial pressures, and trying to adopt new technologies.
So that leads to a final thought, perhaps for you, the listener, to consider. India's energy sector is changing fast. There's a huge push towards renewables. Decarbonization is the buzzword. So how does a company like JPVL, with a large base of existing thermal power plants, adapt its strategy for the long term?
Right. How do they manage those legacy assets responsibly, deal with historical financial issues, and position themselves for a future that looks increasingly different?
It really makes you think about the complexity of balancing national energy needs, environmental goals, and financial survival in this evolving market.
Absolutely. It's not a simple equation.
If you want to explore this further, definitely check out the full annual report. We'll put a link in the show notes. It's worth looking at these things from different angles, about the investor perspective, the environmental perspective, the community perspective.
Great point.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.